The small town had a rhythm of its own, slower and more deliberate than the bustling cities far away. As the day approached for the soldiers to return, every house seemed to be holding its breath, infused with a palpable sense of anticipation. In one such home, Maria meticulously rearranged the furniture in her son's room, her hands trembling slightly with a mix of nerves and excitement. She had spent the last week cleaning and organizing, making sure everything was just as her son, Jake, had left it before he was deployed. Across the street, the Thompson family hung up a new flag in their front yard, its bright colors a stark contrast against the dull winter sky. Little Sarah Thompson, only 6 years old, had made a welcome home sign with crayons, her letters uneven and colorful. She asked her mother every morning if today was the day her brother would walk through the door. At the local church, Pastor Jim led a group of volunteers who were preparing care packages for returning troops. They packed homemade cookies, knitted scarves, and letters of gratitude into boxes that would be handed out upon the soldiers' arrival. The whole community seemed to come together, sharing stories of their loved ones who were coming home, each story a thread in the fabric of their shared anticipation. Elsewhere, at the local diner, a reserved table sat by the window, adorned with a small sign that read, "Reserved for our heroes." The diner owner, Mr. Parker, a veteran himself, knew too well the emotions of coming home. He spent his mornings over coffee with other veterans, discussing the best ways to support the returning soldiers. In these final days leading up to the reunion, every hour seemed to stretch longer than the one before. Families checked their phones compulsively for any updates on the arrival times. Children rehearsed the things they would say to their returning parents, practicing in front of mirrors or whispering in the dark before sleep. As the sun set the day before the anticipated arrival, Maria stood in Jake's room, looking around to make sure everything was perfect. She adjusted a picture frame, straightened a stack of books, and fluffed the pillows one last time. Outside, the Thompsons gathered under their newly hung flag, holding each other close, their faces illuminated by the porch light. Pastor Jim locked the church doors, the care packages stacked high and ready for the morning. The whole town was wrapped in a silent vigil, waiting for the dawn when they would finally see their soldiers. Their sons, daughters, fathers, and mothers marched back into their lives. The night was long and filled with dreams, both sweet and anxious, as they awaited the moment that would bring their long wait to an end. The journey back home for the soldiers was filled with a mix of relief and apprehension. As their transport plane cut through the skies, the quiet hum of the engine served as a backdrop to their own scattered thoughts and whispered conversations. Each soldier had their own way of dealing with the transition from military life back to the civilian world. Some stared out the windows, lost in the clouds in their thoughts, while others tried to catch some sleep, their bodies slumped against the uncomfortable seats, dreaming of home. Michael, a young soldier with a quick smile, pulled out a tattered notebook from his bag and began to jot down his plans for the future. He wrote about going back to school, about the business he dreamed of opening, and about the simple joy of sleeping in his own bed. Beside him, his friend Lucas listened to a playlist of old songs, the kind that had always reminded him of home. The music was low, but the emotion it evoked was heavy in his heart. In another row, Sergeant Davis held a worn photograph of his 2 daughters. They were going to be taller, he thought, probably not the little girls he remembered. He practiced the speeches he had rehearsed in his mind, the apologies for missed birthdays, and the promises of never missing another. Around him, the cabin was filled with similar scenes, soldiers clutching photos, some silent, some chatting anxiously about their first meal back, whether they wanted a juicy burger or their mom's homemade pie. The flight attendant, a middle-aged woman with a gentle manner, made her rounds, offering comfort along with the usual snacks and drinks. She had seen many soldiers come and go, her presence a calming assurance in the cramped space, filled with mixed emotions. As the plane began its descent, the reality of returning home began to sink in. The soldiers peered eagerly out the windows, pointing out landmarks and the familiar terrain that meant they were nearly there. The chatter increased, a buzz of excitement replacing the contemplative silence of the earlier flight. Finally, the plane touched down, a smooth landing that drew a collective sigh of relief from its passengers. The seatbelt sign blinked off, and they all stood, stretching cramped limbs, gathering their meager belongings. The exit door opened, and a rush of fresh air filled the cabin, carrying with it the sense of home, of grass, of rain from earlier that day, of freedom. They filed out slowly, a line of fatigue-clad figures, their boots thumping lightly against the tarmac. Each step was a step closer to their loved ones, to the life they had paused, and now were about to resume. As they walked towards the airport terminal, each soldier carried not just their gear, but a bundle of hopes and fears about the reunions awaiting them. The journey home was over, but another journey, that of reintegration and healing, was just beginning. The airport was alive with energy, a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation. Families gathered near the arrival gate, holding welcome signs, balloons, and banners. Some stood still, their eyes glued to the screen that showed the flight's status, while others paced back and forth, unable to contain their emotions. The air was thick with expectation, a moment that had been long awaited, one that felt almost unreal after so many months or even years apart. Maria stood near the front, gripping her purse tightly. Her heart pounded as she tried to steady her breathing. She had imagined this moment countless times, how her son, Jake, would look, how she would greet him. Would she cry? Would she be able to say anything at all? She clutched the small framed photo she had carried with her since his deployment, a picture of them together before he left. Just a few steps away, little Sarah Thompson held onto her mother's hand, standing on her toes to see over the crowd. She had drawn a picture for her brother, Tommy, with bright colors and big, happy letters that spelled "Welcome Home." Her tiny hands gripped the paper tightly, as if afraid the moment would slip away if she let go. As the minutes stretched, an announcement finally echoed through the terminal. Flight 672 from overseas has now arrived. A collective hush fell over the crowd for a brief moment. Then whispers, gasps, and the rustling of excitement took over. Everyone craned their necks toward the doors, eyes locked on the passageway where the soldiers would appear. Then, one by one, they stepped out. The first few soldiers emerged, their uniforms crisp but their faces weary from the long journey. Their eyes darted around, scanning the crowd, searching for the faces they had missed most. Some walked briskly, some hesitated, almost afraid that this was still just another dream. Maria's breath caught in her throat when she saw Jake. He was there, in front of her, no longer a memory, no longer a voice over a crackly phone call. He was real, walking toward her with the same determined stride she remembered. His uniform was neat, his face more mature, his eyes holding a mix of exhaustion and relief. For a split second, neither of them moved. Then, all at once, she rushed forward, throwing her arms around him. Her tears spilled freely now, her hands gripping him tightly as if afraid he would vanish. Nearby, Sarah let go of her mother's hand, sprinting forward before anyone could stop her. "Tommy," she cried, her voice full of pure, unfiltered joy. Her brother barely had time to react before she crashed into his legs, hugging him with all her strength. He laughed, bending down to scoop her up in his arms. "You got taller," he teased, ruffling her hair. "I missed you, Bug." All around them, similar reunions unfolded. Tears, laughter, hugs that seemed to last forever. Fathers lifted their children into the air. Wives held their husbands close. Mothers kissed the foreheads of their returning sons and daughters. Some spoke through choked sobs. Others simply held on, words failing in the weight of the moment. For these families, time had paused for too long. But now, in this moment, it raced forward, making up for all the lost days in the only way it could, with love, warmth, and the unbreakable bond of those who had waited, and those who had finally come home. The moment of reunion felt like a dream, one that families had imagined over and over again during long, lonely nights. But now it was real. The first few seconds after seeing each other were filled with emotions too strong to put into words. Time seemed to slow as soldiers and their loved ones melted into each other's arms, holding on as if afraid to let go. Maria gripped her son Jake tightly, her face buried in his chest. She could feel the steady beat of his heart, a reminder that he was here, safe. She had prayed for this moment for months, sending silent wishes into the night sky, hoping her boy would come home in one piece. Now, with her arms wrapped around him, she felt whole again. "I missed you so much," she whispered through her tears. Jake held her just as tightly, his strong arms offering comfort that went both ways. "I'm home now, Mom." Nearby, little Sarah refused to let go of her brother Tommy. Her small hands clung to his uniform like he might disappear if she loosened her grip. "You're really here," she said, her voice filled with awe. Tommy chuckled, lifting her up into his arms. "Of course I am, kiddo. I promised I'd come back, didn't I?" She nodded, her tears mixing with a giggle. "Mom and I made a cake for you," she added excitedly, as if that were the most important part of the moment. A few feet away, an older man named Mr. Parker, a veteran himself, watched the scene unfold with misty eyes. He had been in their place once, stepping off a plane, searching for familiar faces. He knew that nothing compared to the first embrace after months or years apart. He approached a young soldier standing alone and clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Someone waiting for you, son?" he asked. The soldier swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah, my wife. She should be here somewhere." Before he could finish, a woman with a baby in her arms rushed forward, her sobs breaking through the noise of the crowd. "James," she cried, and in an instant he had his family in his arms. The terminal buzzed with laughter, tears, and soft whispers. Some soldiers wiped their eyes discreetly, embarrassed by their own emotions, but no one here judged. Even strangers felt the weight of these moments, offering warm smiles and pats on the back as they passed by. One reunion after another, time seemed to stop for every family wrapped in their own world of happiness. Some couples kissed for the first time in what felt like forever, their hands pressed against each other's faces, memorizing every detail. Parents ran their fingers through their children's hair, as if checking to make sure they were still the same, still theirs. For the soldiers, the world outside had been loud and uncertain. But here, in the arms of their families, everything was quiet, safe, and familiar. They had made it home, and for now, that was all that mattered. The drive home felt unreal. The familiar streets, the small shops, the trees lining the roads, it was all the same, yet everything felt different. For the soldiers, the world had changed while they were gone, but so had they. Sitting in the car, watching the scenery pass by, they felt a mix of excitement and uncertainty. Maria kept glancing at Jake through the rearview mirror as she drove. He was looking out the window, quiet, as if absorbing every little detail. "Everything's just like you left it," she said softly. Jake smiled a little. "Yeah, but it feels different somehow." He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because, for so long, he had only seen these streets in his memories, and now they were real again. At the Thompson house, Sarah could barely contain her energy. As soon as they pulled into the driveway, she jumped out of the car, dragging Tommy by the hand. "Come on, you have to see the sign I made for you." Tommy laughed, letting himself be pulled along. His mother stood back, watching them, her heart swelling with happiness. It had been so long since she had seen her son truly smile. Inside their homes, soldiers stepped into familiar spaces, their eyes scanning everything as if seeing them for the first time. Jake walked into his room, pausing in the doorway. It looked exactly the same. His books still on the shelf, his old posters on the wall, his bed neatly made by his mother. He ran his fingers along the desk, feeling the smooth surface. It was strange, being back in a place that had once been his whole world. Downstairs, Maria busied herself in the kitchen, preparing Jake's favorite meal. It was her way of showing love, making sure everything felt normal. "I hope you're hungry," she called out. Jake took a deep breath, shaking off the heavy feeling in his chest. "Starving," he replied, forcing himself to smile as he joined her at the table. In another home, Tommy sat on the couch with Sarah, curled up beside him, her head resting on his arm. "Tell me a story about where you were," she asked. Tommy hesitated for a moment before deciding to keep it light. "Well, there was this one time a monkey stole my sandwich." Sarah's eyes widened. "No way." Tommy grinned, glad to see her laugh. Not every moment was easy, though. Some soldiers found themselves pausing in doorways, overwhelmed by memories. Others sat in their rooms late at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long it would take to feel normal again. But despite the adjustments, there was comfort in small things: a warm meal, the smell of home, the sound of familiar voices. For now, being home was enough. It wasn't perfect, and it might take time to fully settle in, but surrounded by family, by love, they knew they had made it. And that was the most important thing of all. The first few days at home were filled with joy, laughter, and endless conversations. Families stayed up late, talking about everything and nothing, trying to make up for lost time. But as the excitement of the reunion slowly settled, reality started to sink in. Life had moved forward while the soldiers were away, and now they had to find their place in it again. Jake sat at the kitchen table one morning, staring at his plate of eggs and toast. His mother, Maria, watched him carefully. "Not hungry?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. Jake shook his head. "Just thinking." He wasn't sure how to explain it, but something felt off. The house was the same, his family was the same, but he felt like a stranger in his own home. At the Thompson house, Tommy found himself struggling with simple things. The loud noises of the TV startled him, and he caught himself flinching at sudden sounds. At dinner, his mom noticed how he barely spoke, his usual jokes missing from the conversation. "Everything okay, honey?" she asked gently. Tommy forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." He didn't want to worry them. They had waited so long for him to come home. He didn't want to ruin the happiness. Sarah, noticing her brother's quietness, did her best to cheer him up. "Hey, Tommy, wanna play our old board game?" she asked excitedly. Tommy hesitated. It had been years since he sat down to play a simple game like that, but seeing the hope in his little sister's eyes, he nodded. "Yeah, why not?" As they played, Sarah giggled every time she won a round. And for the first time in days, Tommy truly laughed. But adjusting wasn't just hard for the soldiers, it was hard for their families too. Maria woke up one night to find Jake sitting in the living room, staring out the window. She sat beside him. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. Jake sighed. "I got used to sleeping with noise. The silence feels strange." Maria placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, son. Take your time. We're here for you." In town, a few soldiers met up at the diner, sharing quiet conversations over coffee. They didn't need to say much. Just being around others who understood was enough. Mr. Parker, the veteran who had welcomed them at the airport, joined them. "The hardest part isn't the fight," he said, stirring his coffee. "It's coming home and feeling like you don't fit anymore. But you do. It just takes time." Slowly, bit by bit, things started feeling a little easier. Some days were good, some were tough, but surrounded by family, friends, and familiar places, the soldiers took each step forward. Home wasn't just a place, it was the people who loved them, waiting patiently as they found their way back to themselves. As the days turned into weeks, the community around the soldiers began to play a significant role in their reintegration. The town, which had held its breath for so long, seemed to exhale all at once, offering the soldiers a space to heal, not just with their families, but with everyone who had supported them from afar. There was a sense of togetherness that couldn't be ignored, and slowly, soldiers began to feel that they weren't alone in their journey. One evening, the local church held a small welcome-back celebration. Pastor Jim had invited the families of the soldiers, and there was a spread of homemade food, music playing softly in the background, and a feeling of calm that wrapped around everyone. It wasn't a huge gathering, but it was heartfelt. There were no speeches or fanfare, just neighbors talking, laughing, and catching up with the soldiers. Jake stood by the punch table, a plate of cookies in his hand, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't help but notice how everyone seemed so normal, how easy it was for them to go about their daily lives. He was happy to be home, yes, but there were moments when he felt disconnected, as if the world around him had moved on without him. It was hard to explain to anyone who hadn't been there, hard to put into words the strange mix of relief and disorientation he felt. Maria watched her son from across the room, knowing he wasn't fully himself yet. But she also saw the small changes, the moments where he laughed at a joke, or the way his eyes lingered on a familiar face. It wasn't going to be easy, but she knew he would get there. They all would. Across the room, Tommy stood talking with a few of his old friends. It had been a while since they'd seen each other, but the moment they all began reminiscing about their childhood, it felt as though no time had passed. Tommy was still getting used to being back, but seeing his friends smile and joke around helped ease the pressure he'd been feeling. It felt good to know that no matter how much he had changed, some things stayed the same. At the end of the evening, Pastor Jim stepped up to the front, a warm smile on his face. "Tonight, we're not just celebrating the return of our soldiers," he said. "We're celebrating what they've done for us. We're celebrating all of us, because we're stronger when we stand together." The simple words echoed through the room, and for a moment, it felt like everyone was united, not just as a community, but as one extended family, working together to heal and grow. After the event, a few soldiers gathered in the parking lot outside, reluctant to go home just yet. The conversation shifted from the war to the mundane, what they were going to do the next day, how the town had changed, what they wanted for dinner. It wasn't much, but it was exactly what they needed. A chance to breathe, to laugh, and to be part of something greater than themselves. For the soldiers, reintegration wasn't just about coming home. It was about finding their place again in the world, supported by family, friends, and the community that had always been there. It was a long road, but with every step, they were getting closer to feeling whole again. As the weeks passed, a sense of calm began to settle over the soldiers and their families. The chaos of their return had slowed down, and now it was time to rebuild, not just physically, but emotionally. For many of the soldiers, it was an ongoing journey, a path they had to walk at their own pace. Some days felt like a fresh start, while others felt heavy with the weight of everything they had been through. Jake woke up one morning and decided to take a walk. It was a simple thing, but for him, it felt like a small victory. He had been staying inside most days, overwhelmed by the adjustment. But today, the air felt crisp, and the sun was shining just right. As he walked through the quiet streets, he found a bit of peace. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just enjoying the feeling of his feet hitting the pavement. When he got to the park, he saw some kids playing soccer, their laughter echoing in the open space. He stopped for a moment, watching them with a smile, reminded of simpler times. As he continued walking, he couldn't help but think about how much he had missed the normal parts of life, the things that didn't involve war, the things that everyone took for granted. That evening, Jake sat down at the dinner table with his family. His mom had made his favorite meal again, but this time, it was different. There was a sense of comfort in the air, like everything was starting to settle. After dinner, they sat around, just talking, about the weather, about the neighbors, about plans for the weekend. It wasn't a deep conversation, but it was enough. It was moments like these that helped him feel like he was finding his way back. Over at the Thompson house, Tommy was beginning to find his rhythm again too. It hadn't been easy at first. There were still moments when he felt disconnected, like he didn't quite fit in. But he started to see the familiar things in a new light. One afternoon, Sarah dragged him outside to play catch, and for the first time in a long while, he felt free. There was no weight of the past, no thoughts about the future, just the present moment. The next day, Tommy joined his friends at the local cafe. They talked about old times, laughed about silly things, and caught up on what they had missed while he was away. It wasn't a life-changing conversation, but it was healing. It reminded him that life still went on, that his place in it was still there, waiting for him to step back into it. The community continued to show their support. Neighbors invited the soldiers over for barbecues, small gatherings where they could relax and share stories. The town had become more than just a place. It had become a part of the healing process, a reminder that no one was truly alone. For the soldiers, returning home had been the start of a new chapter. It hadn't been easy, and the road ahead would still have its challenges, but they had taken the first step. Each day, they found their way a little more, learning how to live in a world that had changed while they were away. And slowly they began to realize that while they had been fighting for others, the love and support of their families, friends, and community was the true foundation that would carry them through the hardest moments.